Encircled by armies, the human raised one flag. The aliens dropped their weapons. The silence in the cell was a living thing, broken only by the low hum of the containment field and the distant, percussive heartbeat of a war he was no longer fighting. Captain Voltair sat on a polished metal slab, the only furniture in the stark white room. His tactical gear was torn and stained with the dust of a fallen city. A neatly trimmed beard framed a jaw set like granite, and his blue-green eyes, steady and unwavering, watched the shimmering energy that served as his door. He had been the last voice on the command net, the last rifle firing from the citadel of Viridia's shattered walls. Now, he was the prize. The hum of the field changed pitch. A figure resolved out of the light on the other side, stepping through with a grace that was utterly alien. Inquisitor Prime Juturna was a vision of severe perfection. Tall and slender, her immaculate black and silver uniform seemed to absorb the sterile light of the cell. Her skin was the color of slate, smooth and unblemished save for the faint, iridescent markings that traced the high arches of her cheekbones. Her silver eyes, large and analytical, fixed on him. They held no malice, no triumph. They held only the promise of disassembly, a methodical taking apart of his mind until every secret was laid bare. She stopped a precise 3 meters from him, her posture a study in absolute authority. "Captain Voltair," she said. Her voice was like the room, clean, cold, without echo. "You are the last officer of the 7th Vanguard. The citadel has fallen. Your resistance is concluded." Voltaire ran a hand over his beard, the rasp of it loud in the quiet. He did not rise. He simply met her gaze. "Inquisitor," he acknowledged, his voice a low gravel. "I was wondering when you'd stop sending subordinates." Juturna's expression did not change, but he saw the slightest narrowing of her silver eyes. She was cataloging him, the powerful, athletic build, the unbowed set of his shoulders, the intelligence that burned behind his weariness. She took a single, silent step forward, then another. She moved like a predator, each motion economical and deliberate. She circled him slowly, her gaze raking over every detail of his worn uniform, every scratch on his armor plates. He remained perfectly still, a rock in the current of her assessment. She was using proximity as a tool, a way to establish dominance, to shrink his world until it contained nothing but her. She came to a halt directly in front of him, so close he could feel the faint coolness radiating from her body. He had to tilt his head back slightly to meet her eyes. The iridescent markings on her temples seemed to shift with the light, a subtle, hypnotic pattern. "Your species is a paradox," she stated, her voice a soft murmur that was more unnerving than a shout. "You fight with no logical expectation of victory. You sacrifice assets for sentimental objectives. I am here to understand this illogic. I am here to understand you." "You want to know why we fight," Voltaire said, his tone flat. "I want to know the strategic architecture of your tenacity. It is a flaw in our calculations. You are that flaw, Captain, and I will correct it." She raised her hand, her long, slender fingers extending toward his face. He did not flinch as her cool fingertips brushed the faint scar cutting through his left eyebrow. Her touch was clinical, a scientist examining a specimen, yet it sent a jolt through him. It was the first touch he had felt from another living being in weeks that was not violent. For a breath, her silver eyes lost their analytical edge and simply watched him, searching for the flicker of fear, the sign of submission. He gave her nothing but the steady beat of his own heart, a defiant rhythm in the sterile silence of the cage she had built for him. The interrogations became a ritual.
Each cycle, Juturna would arrive with a new methodology, a new line of logical assault. She projected holographic battlefields on the white walls, presenting him with tactical scenarios that were flawless in their Xylosian geometry. She demanded he analyze troop movements, supply logistics, orbital trajectories. To her, war was mathematics. She expected him to engage her on that level, to reveal the hidden variables in the human equation. He refused to play. He sat on his slab, watching the glowing formations swirl around him, and answered her questions with stories. When she demanded to know why the 7th Vanguard had held the North Ridge against a force 10 times its size, he did not speak of firing lines or fallback points. He spoke of Sergeant Eva Rostova, a woman who could grow tomatoes anywhere, even in the hydroponics bay of a besieged citadel. He described the taste of a sun-warmed tomato, the burst of sweetness and acid on the tongue, a flavor so potent that it could make a soldier remember what they were fighting for. "This data is irrelevant," Juturna said, her voice tight. The holographic tanks and soldiers wavered around them. "Taste is not a tactical asset." "Isn't it?" Voltaire countered, his blue-green eyes fixed on her. "Isn't a memory worth defending? You think we held the ridge for the territory. We held it for the memory of tomatoes, Inquisitor, for the right to taste something real again." He continued this pattern, meeting every cold query with a blast of sensual, illogical humanity. He answered a question about munitions expenditure with the description of the scent of rain on dry asphalt after a long drought. He countered a probe about chain of command protocols,
explaining the profound, unspoken trust forged between soldiers who have shared their last ration of water. He spoke of music, of laughter, of the warmth of a fire on a cold night. Juturna's perfect composure began to show the faintest of cracks. He saw it in the way her fingers would tighten into a fist at her side, the subtle tension in her jaw. The most telling sign was the iridescent markings on her temples. When she was processing his disruptive data, they would shimmer, shifting from their usual cool blue to a faint, troubled violet. He had found a weapon she had no defense against, her own imagination. He was planting seeds of doubt in the sterile soil of her logic. "You speak of hope as a quantifiable resource," she said one cycle, her frustration finally showing a razor's edge. "This is a cognitive defect, a belief in a positive outcome despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary." "It's the only resource that matters when all the others are gone," he said softly. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Have you ever hoped for anything, Inquisitor? Not calculated, not predicted. Just wanted something, with no evidence you would ever get it." Her silver eyes stared at him, and for the first time, he saw not an interrogator, but a being confronted with a universe of concepts she had no framework for. The iridescent markings on her temples were more pronounced than ever. He watched her mouth, a perfect severe line, and wondered if she had ever tasted anything that was not synthesized nutrient paste. He wondered if she knew what it felt like to be truly warm or truly cold. He was no longer just defending his mind. He was on the attack, waging a quiet, intimate war against the very foundation of her reality. The citadel's bones groaned. A deep, resonant impact shuddered through the detention block, a shockwave that was felt more than heard. It was not the familiar rhythm of the siege. It was something bigger, more violent. Human artillery, Voltaire thought with a grim satisfaction. The old guns still had a voice. The white lights in the interrogation room flickered and died, plunging them into absolute darkness. The hum of the energy fields cut out, replaced by the grating screech of stressed metal and the patter of dust from the ceiling. For this session, Juturna had unshackled him. They had been standing in the center of the room when the world had turned to violent motion. In the blackness, there was a sharp crack as a ceiling conduit snapped. Voltaire moved on pure instinct. He did not lunge for the door or for her.
He took 2 quick steps and his arm shot out, not to strike, but to brace. His hand met a falling piece of equipment just before it would have struck her. The heavy panels slammed into his palm, but he held it, his muscles straining. They were frozen in the dark, inches apart. The roles of captor and prisoner had vanished, dissolved by the primal reality of the attack. He was just a man holding up a heavy object. She was just a woman standing in its path. He could feel the warmth of her body, a startling contrast to her usual cool detachment. He could hear her breathing, a quiet, sharp intake of air that was not perfectly controlled. "Report," her voice cut through the darkness, still crisp but with a new, thinner timbre. She was speaking into her wrist comm. Silence answered. The emergency power kicked in a moment later, casting the room in a blood-red glow. Voltair looked at her. Her silver eyes were wide, fixed on his arm, which was locked, straining, holding the conduit panel a foot above her head. Her perfect facade was gone. In its place was something raw, something he had not seen before. Vulnerability. A 4-armed Xylosian warden lay groaning near the wall, stunned by the impact. They were, for all intents and purposes, alone. He shifted his grip, pushing the panel away until it crashed against the far wall with a deafening clang. He shook his hand, his fingers numb. He looked back at her. The red light painted her slate-gray skin in demonic shades, but her expression was one of profound stillness. Her analytical gaze was gone, replaced by a deep, searching look. The shared, violent moment had forged a new context between them, an intimacy born of chaos that was more potent than any of her calculated psychological pressures. The pressure on Juturna from the Xylosian High Command was becoming immense. The human strategist had not broken. He had, in some inexplicable way, begun to blunt the edge of their finest interrogator. Her subcommander, a broad, aggressive Xylosian, who saw nuance as weakness, urged for termination. Juturna, citing the asset's potential value, demanded one final, more aggressive approach. She brought Voltair to the synaptic sanctum, a chamber at the heart of the detention block, where minds could be forcibly interfaced. Voltair was strapped into a chair that looked like a throne of black metal and wires. A neurocrown, a circlet of silver needles, was lowered onto his head. He met Juturna's gaze across the console. Her face was an impassive mask, but her silver eyes held a flicker of something he couldn't name. Reluctance? Or was it excitement?
"This will not be a conversation, Captain," she said, her voice resonating slightly in the chamber. "I will take the information I require." "You can take what you find," he replied, his voice calm, "but you might not like what you see." The connection slammed into him like a physical blow. It was not a gentle probe, it was an invasion. She bypassed his conscious thought, plunging directly into the raw data of his memories. She was searching for troop deployments, weapon schematics, command codes. What she found was the screaming, chaotic reality of a human soul. She felt the bone-jarring recoil of his rifle, the acrid taste of cordite in his throat. She experienced the searing pain of a shrapnel wound to his leg, the gut-wrenching grief as he held a dying comrade's hand. She was drowning in a sea of sensation. Then came the other memories, the warmth of a woman's body pressed against his in the dark, the whisper of a laugh against his skin, the intoxicating taste of a kiss, the quiet pride of watching his unit's banner raised over a hard-won outpost. These were not data points. They were life, messy and vibrant and full of contradictions she could not parse. The onslaught of pure, unfiltered human experience was an agony for her logical mind. She was lost. And in that moment, as her consciousness reeled, Voltaire acted. His own mind, trained and disciplined for this exact violation, pushed back. He did not fight her presence. He used it. He followed the path of her connection back out of his own mind and into hers. He moved through the cold, clean corridors of her consciousness, a ghost in her machine. She was so overwhelmed by his memories that she never felt his subtle intrusion.
Through her, he touched the periphery of the Xylosian battle network, the constant stream of data that connected every soldier, every ship, every tactical drone. He didn't try to steal information, he simply observed. He traced the pathways of their logic, the rigid, predictable protocols that governed their every action. He saw how they processed threats, how they assessed defiance, how they calculated victory. And there, buried deep in the core of their perfect system, he found it. A single, elegant, catastrophic flaw. He mapped it, memorized it, and withdrew, leaving her drowning in the memory of a lover's touch. Juturna ripped her consciousness from the link, gasping as if she had been holding her breath for an eternity. The link was severed. She stumbled back from the console, one hand pressed to her temple, where the iridescent markings now blazed with a furious, chaotic violet. She stared at Voltair, who sat slumped in the chair, his breathing heavy. He looked exhausted, violated. But when he lifted his head, his blue-green eyes were clear and sharp. They held a terrifying new depth that she could feel but not comprehend. The interrogation was over. She had plunged into his soul and found chaos. He had slipped into her mind and found a key. The synaptic link shattered Juturna's certainty. The cold mathematics of her world now had emotional, sensory variables she could not ignore. The concept of grief was no longer a clinical term for reduced unit effectiveness. It was the hollow ache she had felt from Voltaire's memory of his fallen friend. Love was no longer an illogical biochemical impulse. It was the overwhelming warmth she had experienced in the phantom embrace of a woman she had never met. She spent a full cycle in her private quarters, watching the playback of his memories, the raw data streaming across her holographic displays like an alien poetry. Her sub-commander saw her state as a catastrophic failure. He demanded she cede the asset. She refused. Driven by a compulsion she did not understand, she dismissed her guards and went to Voltaire's cell late in the silent hours of the cycle. She stood before the shimmering energy field, her perfect posture for once lacking its rigid certainty. He was awake, sitting on the edge of his slab as if he had been expecting her. The experience was disorienting, she said, the admission costing her a visible effort. War is, he replied simply. No, not the battle data. She took a step closer to the field. The other memories, the personal connections, they serve no tactical purpose. Why store them with such intensity? The power dynamic had completely inverted. She was no longer the Inquisitor. She was a student, seeking to understand a text written in a language she was only just beginning to decipher. He was no longer the prisoner, but the keeper of a dangerous and seductive knowledge. He said, "They're the only things that have a purpose. They're the things you take with you. They're the why." Juturna stared at him, her silver eyes filled with a conflict that seemed to tear at the very fabric of her being. She needed more data, but not the kind her instruments could read. She needed a physical data point. Acting on an impulse that defied every protocol she had ever known, she raised her hand and slowly pushed her fingers towards the containment field. The energy crackled around her hand, a soft hiss of warning. She ignored it, pressing forward until the tips of her fingers passed through the shimmering barrier. An alarm should have sounded. It did not. Perhaps he had done something during the link. Voltaire watched her, his expression unreadable. He did not move as her cool, slate-gray fingers reached for him. Her touch was hesitant, exploratory, as she pressed her first two fingers against the pulse point on his wrist. His skin was hot against her cool flesh. His pulse was a strong, steady beat under her fingertips. A purely scientific gesture, a measurement of his physiological state, yet it was the most intimate act of her entire existence. She could feel the life in him, the steady, stubborn rhythm of the illogical, paradoxical creature before her. He turned his wrist slightly, his thumb brushing against the back of her hand. The contact was electric. Her breath hitched, and she pulled her hand back as if burned, the iridescent markings at her temples flashing a brilliant, panicked silver. She had come for answers and had only found more and much more dangerous questions. Juturna's erratic behavior did not go unnoticed. Her subcommander formally challenged her authority before the Xylosian Command Council. He presented a damning case. The Inquisitor Prime, their most potent psychological weapon, had been compromised by the human
prisoner. Weeks of interrogation had yielded no actionable intelligence. The siege of Viridia was at a stalemate. The humans' continued existence was a monument to their failure. He demanded Voltaire's immediate and public execution as a message to the remnants of the human forces. The elder tactician, a withered Xylosian whose skin was a roadmap of ancient campaigns, nodded in agreement. The asset has proven resistant. The logic of continued investment is flawed. Terminate. Juturna stood before them, the cool light of the council chamber glinting off her immaculate uniform. She felt a cold dread, an emotion her people had nearly bred out of their species. The thought of Voltaire's death, of that vibrant, defiant mind being extinguished, was inefficient, unacceptable. She had to protect him. Not for the Xylosian Empire, she realized with a sickening lurch, for herself. She needed to understand the puzzle he represented, and she could not do that if he was dead. "You are correct," she began, her voice steady and clear, betraying none of her internal turmoil. "My current methods have reached their logical limit, but termination is a crude solution. It yields no new data." She paused, letting her words settle in the silent chamber. "I propose a final gambit, a display of overwhelming psychological force. Bring the human to the Citadel's highest battlement at dawn. Let him see our armada. Let him witness the absolute certainty of his extinction. I will offer him a final choice: surrender the secrets of human strategy or be executed, on the spot, by my own hand." The sub-commander sneered. "He will refuse. He is a zealot." "Then his public execution will serve as a powerful symbol of our resolve," Juturna countered smoothly. "If he accepts, we gain everything. If he refuses, we lose nothing and still achieve your desired outcome. It is a scenario with no logical downside." The council considered her proposal. The cold, ruthless logic of it appealed to them. It was a clean equation. They gave their assent. Juturna had won him a single day. As she left the chamber, the weight of her wager settled upon her. She had tied her fate to his. If he died, a part of her newfound, confusing understanding of the universe would die with him. Miles away, in his cell, Voltaire sat in the dim light. The distant rumbles of the war had faded to a low thrum. He seemed to be in a state of quiet meditation. With methodical patience, he worked at the reinforced hem of his combat trousers. Using a shard of metal he had scraped from the underside of his slab, he slowly, painstakingly sawed at the thick, synthweave fibers. After hours of silent labor, a long, narrow strip of dark gray fabric came free. He held it up, inspecting its length. Then he began tearing another. He was calm, focused, his hands moving with the steady purpose of a man who knows exactly what he must do next. He was not waiting for his execution. He was preparing for his victory. The cycle drew to a close. The artificial lights in the detention block dimmed, mimicking a night that this deep-level complex never saw. The sounds of the citadel above were muted, a hush falling over the besieged fortress as both sides prepared for the dawn. Juturna came to him one last time. She disabled the audio recorders and the visual sensors, granting them a privacy that was both a gift and a confession. She stood before the shimmering field, no longer his inquisitor, he no longer her prisoner. They were just two beings on the precipice of an unknown event. "They agreed to your terms," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she confirmed, her voice low. "At dawn, on the spire." She watched him, her silver eyes trying to penetrate the calm facade he wore so effortlessly. He showed no fear, no anger. He looked like a man who had already accepted his fate, and it infuriated her. "Why?" she asked, the single word raw and honest. "Why not yield? Why choose termination over cooperation? It is the height of illogic." "There are things you don't surrender," he said, his gaze intense.
He rose from the slab and walked to the energy barrier, stopping so close that his heat washed over the shimmering field. He did not flinch. On the other side, after a long, silent moment, Juturna mirrored the gesture. Her palm aligned perfectly with his, separated by that untouchable barrier of light and power. They could not feel each other, but they could see the shape of each other's hands, the lines of their palms, the length of their fingers. A connection that was both absolute and infinitely distant. The council considered her proposal. The cold, ruthless logic of it appealed to them. It was a clean equation. They gave their assent. Juturna had won him a single day. As she left the chamber, the weight of her wager settled upon her. She had tied her fate to his. If he died, a part of her newfound, confusing understanding of the universe would die with him. Miles away, in his cell, Voltaire sat in the dim light. The distant rumbles of the war had faded to a low thrum. He seemed to be in a state of quiet meditation. With methodical patience, he worked at the reinforced hem of his combat trousers. Using a shard of metal he had scraped from the underside of his slab, he slowly, painstakingly sawed at the thick synthweave fibers. After hours of silent labor, a long, narrow strip of dark gray fabric came free. He held it up, inspecting its length. Then he began tearing another. He was calm, focused, his hands moving with the steady purpose of a man who knows exactly what he must do next. He was not waiting for his execution. He was preparing for his victory. The cycle drew to a close. The artificial lights in the detention block dimmed, mimicking a night that this deep-level complex never saw. The sounds of the citadel above were muted, a hush falling over the besieged fortress as both sides prepared for the dawn. Juturna came to him one last time. She disabled the audio recorders and the visual sensors, granting them a privacy that was both a gift and a confession. She stood before the shimmering field, no longer his inquisitor, he no longer her prisoner. They were just two beings on the precipice of an unknown event. They agreed to your terms, he said. It was not a question. Yes, she confirmed, her voice low. At dawn, on the spire. She watched him, her silver eyes trying to penetrate the calm facade he wore so effortlessly. He showed no fear, no anger. He looked like a man who had already accepted his fate, and it infuriated her. Why, she asked, the single word raw and honest. Why not yield? Why choose termination over cooperation? It is the height of illogic. There are things you don't surrender, he said, his gaze intense. He rose from the slab and walked to the energy barrier, stopping so close that his heat washed over the shimmering field. He did not flinch. On the other side, after a long, silent moment, Juturna mirrored the gesture. Her palm aligned perfectly with his, separated by that untouchable barrier of light and power. They could not feel each other, but they could see the shape of each other's hands, the lines of their fingers, the length of their fingers. A connection that was both absolute and infinitely distant. What will you do? He asked softly, his eyes never leaving hers. She had no answer. Her entire life had been a series of logical progressions, of missions and objectives. The concept of after was a void. He had broken her world, and she had no idea what to build in its place. She simply stood there, her hand pressed against his, a silent
testament to the man who had waged a war, not on her armies, but on her heart. The man she would have to kill in the morning. The ascent to the spire was a long, silent journey through the citadel's wounded heart. Voltaire was flanked by 4 hulking Xylosian wardens, their quad-armed frames and impassive faces a constant, intimidating presence. They climbed spiraling staircases that were cracked and strewn with rubble, passing through grand halls now scarred by plasma fire. For the first time, Voltaire saw the full scope of the Xylosian occupation, the sheer, overwhelming force that had crushed his comrades. Yet, as they climbed higher, glimpses of the sky appeared through shattered arches, a sky the color of a fresh bruise in the moments before dawn. They emerged onto the highest battlement of the citadel. The wind was a physical force, whipping at Voltaire's torn uniform and pulling a low moan from the broken architecture. But it was not the wind that took his breath away. It was the view. Spread out below, stretching to every horizon, was the Xylosian army. It was not a chaotic horde, but a terrifying spectacle of perfect geometric order. Legions of soldiers stood in flawless grids. Tanks and artillery were aligned in vectors of absolute precision. Above, the sky was thick with orbiting warships, their forms blotting out the emerging stars. It was the physical manifestation of logic, a war machine of sublime and terrible perfection. Juturna was waiting for him. She stood alone at the precipice, facing the dawn. She was encased in the ceremonial armor of an Inquisitor Prime, a suit of interlocking black and silver plates that made her look like a goddess of death. A plasma rifle was holstered at her hip. The wind caught the edges of her severe, high-collared cape, making it flutter behind her. When she turned, her face was an impassive mask, but as he drew closer, he saw the raging conflict in her luminous silver eyes. The wardens forced him to his knees a few feet from her. His gaze never left hers. This was a stage, and the audience was an entire army. But the play was only for them. Juturna activated her broadcast comm. Her voice, amplified 1,000 times, rolled across the plains below, clear and cold as glacial ice. Captain Voltair of the human vanguard, you stand as the last symbol of a failed resistance. Before you is the logic of your extinction. Your world has fallen. Your army is broken. Your cause is lost. She paused, letting the weight of the army below press down on him. I offer a final logic. Surrender the core strategies of your species. Give us the calculus of your illogical tenacity. In exchange, your life will be spared. You will be a prisoner, but you will live. Refuse, and your existence is terminated. Now, let your species witness your choice. The wind howled around them. Millions of Xylosian soldiers watched, their helmets all turned toward the tiny figures on the spire. The guns of the fleet above were silent, waiting. Voltaire looked from the endless army back to Juturna. He saw the woman beneath the armor. He saw the turmoil in her eyes, the silent plea for him to choose life, to choose the logical path, to save her from the choice she had made. Slowly, deliberately, he rose to his feet. The wardens tensed, but Juturna gave a slight shake of her head, and they stood down. He was hers to command and hers to kill. Voltaire ignored the legions below. He spoke only to her, his voice unamplified, carried only by the wind between them. Your mistake isn't in your tactics, Inquisitor. It's in your philosophy. You think victory is the goal. You build perfect systems to achieve it, but that perfection is a cage. It makes you predictable. From a hidden pocket inside his torn trousers, he withdrew a folded, scorched piece of cloth. It was the collection of strips he had painstakingly torn and tied together. He shook it out. It was a crude, tattered mockery of a flag, bearing the faded, burned insignia of the 7th Vanguard, the sigil of a striking falcon, now barely visible through the grime and damage. He did not wave it. He did not shout in defiance. He simply took a firm grip on the makeshift pole and raised it, holding it steady against the powerful wind. One small, tattered flag against a sky full of warships, a gesture of pathetic, irrational hope. Juturna watched him, her hand moving slowly to the grip of the plasma rifle at her hip. The army waited, the fleet waited. The universe seemed to hold its breath. This was the moment, the final, irrational act. And then, a single piercing alarm cut through the silence. It came from the command network. Another followed, then another, a cascade of rising panic. On the plains below, the perfect geometric formations wavered. Lights began to flicker on the soldiers' armor, not in synchronized patterns, but in chaotic random bursts. On the flank, a line of tanks powered down, their energy cannons slumping into silence. The sub-commander's voice,
frantic and sharp, erupted over Juturna's private comm. Inquisitor, we have a system-wide paradox error. Tactical network is failing. All units are reporting command lockouts. Juturna stared at Voltair. He stood serene amidst the rising chaos, holding the flag. He looked only at her, and she understood. The flag was not a symbol for his own people. It was a trigger for hers. During their interrogations, he hadn't been defending. He had been studying her, studying the architecture of their battle network. Through the mind link, he had seen the architecture of their battle network. He had planted a seed. A simple, elegant virus. The virus had lain dormant, waiting for two specific inputs. The first was the tactical arrangement of the Xylosian army in a full-scale, quote, victory imminent siege formation, the very formation she had ordered them into for this public display. The second trigger was a specific visual input cross-referenced against the prisoner's psychological state, a human symbol of defiance raised in a situation of no hope. The tattered flag. When the network's logic tried to
Process the two inputs, their own perfect formation for victory against a single illogical act of defiance it was programmed to ignore, it created a cascading, unsolvable paradox, a logical loop that was now crashing their entire perfectly integrated war machine. He hadn't brought a weapon. He was the weapon. Chaos, but a silent, technological chaos. The Xylosian war machine was having a seizure. Formations broke as soldiers stared in confusion at their non-responsive heads-up displays. Vehicles settled as their power systems shut down to prevent catastrophic failure. The orbiting warships, their targeting systems frozen by the same logical paradox, could do nothing but watch. It was a checkmate delivered not by a fleet, but by an idea. The sub-commander was still screaming in her ear, demanding manual overrides, demanding a retreat, demanding she kill the human responsible. But Juturna could not hear him. She could only see Voltair, standing firm against the wind, his blue-green eyes holding hers. He had not defeated her army with force. He had defeated their entire civilization's philosophy with a single, brilliant, and deeply human act. He had turned their greatest strength, their unbending logic, into a fatal weakness. All her life, she had sought to eliminate variables, to create perfect, predictable systems. He had shown her that life, that victory, resided in the unpredictable, the emotional, the illogical. It was the most profound lesson she had ever learned, delivered at the cost of her entire worldview. Slowly, she raised her hand. Not to her weapon, she raised it high for all to see. Her voice, when it came, was no longer amplified. It was quiet, calm, and carried a weight that eclipsed the authority of any fleet. "Stand down," she commanded into her comm, a universal command. Then she broadcast a single order to the millions of soldiers below, an order so alien to their doctrine it had never been uttered in their history. Drop your weapons. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, a sound, a single, resonant clang of metal hitting rock. It was followed by another, and then 100, then thousands. A wave of sound rolled across the plains, a percussive, cascading chorus of surrender. The sound of an army disarming itself, the sound of a war ending. The wind whipped the tattered flag in Voltaire's hand. He lowered it slowly, his gaze still locked with hers. The armies of the Xylosian Empire stood, silent and defeated, amidst their powered-down machines and discarded rifles. On the battlement, surrounded by the evidence of an extraordinary victory, the two of them stood alone. No longer captor and prisoner, no longer enemies. They were the architects of a new and terrifyingly uncertain future, bound together by an act that would be remembered as long as the stars burned in the sky. 6 months later, the wind on the Citadel spire was different.
It still carried the chill of the high altitudes, but it no longer moaned through shattered arches and broken walls. It whispered through the lattices of new construction, a sound of healing instead of grief. Below, the vast plains were not empty, but they were no longer a testament to war. The deep scars in the earth left by Zolocian siege engines were being softened by the green blush of new vegetation. In the distance, the lights of a settlement glowed, a joint human Zolocian outpost built from the ruins, a city founded on the sound of dropped weapons. Voltaire stood at the precipice where he had once knelt. He wore a dark gray, high-collared diplomatic uniform, the fabric crisp and severe, yet it could not conceal the warrior's powerful frame beneath. His beard was as neatly trimmed as it had been in the cell, his blue-green eyes just as intense, but the wariness in them had been replaced by a deep, thoughtful gravity. He was not a prisoner, nor was he simply a soldier anymore. He was an architect of the most fragile peace the galaxy had ever known. He heard her approach, the sound of her footsteps as silent and deliberate as they had been in the interrogation chamber. He did not turn. Juturna came to a stop beside him, the space between them no longer a calculated zone of intimidation, but a comfortable silence. She was not in armor. She wore a long, slate-colored gown that was elegant in its simplicity, its high collar framing her face. The iridescent markings on her temples were calm, shimmering with a soft, steady blue. "It is inefficient," she said, her silver eyes gazing at the sprawling, half-finished city below. "The human sections are asymmetrical. The Zolocian sectors are built on the old grid patterns. They do not integrate logically." Voltaire allowed himself a small smile. "It's messy," he agreed, his voice a low rumble, "full of compromises and contradictions. But it's growing. That's the important part." She turned her gaze from the city to him. The analytical coolness was still there, but it was tempered now with something else, a warmth that was entirely new. "The great paradox, as our historians now call it, has inflicted a similar state upon my people. A generation of our thinkers has been consumed by it. They debate the Voltaire postulate, the theory that a perfect system is inherently flawed because it cannot account for an imperfect act." "Sounds like they're learning," he said softly.
"They are changing," she corrected. "There is art now on Xylos. Music that is not purely mathematical. Dissent. It is chaos. Many blame me. They say I allowed a cognitive plague to infect our civilization." "And what do you say?" he asked, finally turning to face her fully. Juturna held his gaze, her silver eyes unflinching. "I say that for the first time in my existence, I do not have a calculated answer. I only have an observation. We were a people who did not understand the concept of hope. Now we have no choice but to learn it." Her expression softened almost imperceptibly. "I find the process disorienting." He recognized the word she had used after the mind link, and the shared memory hung between them, intimate and profound. In the past, he had used his humanity as a weapon against her. Now it was the foundation of their new reality. He thought of the question he had asked her on that last night in the cell, a question she could not answer. What will you do after this is over? They were living in the after now, and it was more complex and terrifying than any war. Slowly he raised his hand, palm up, in the space between them. It was an offering, a question. After a moment's hesitation, she placed her cool, slate-gray hand in his. The contact was no longer a clinical probe or a desperate gesture through an energy field. It was a simple, solid reality. Her skin was smooth and cool against his warm, calloused flesh. He curled his fingers gently around hers, a silent affirmation. "You're not alone in it," he said. "His own people call me a hero, but some of them look at me with fear. They don't understand how I did it. They don't understand that I couldn't have without you." He had needed her rigid logic as much as she had needed his chaos. He had built the key, but she had shown him the lock. Their conflict had been a strange and violent collaboration, and the peace was their shared responsibility. The flaw was not in your logic, Juturna, he continued, his thumb brushing over the back of her hand. It was in the belief that logic was the only thing that mattered. She looked down at their joined hands, the contrast of their skin, their forms, their entire biologies. It is a variable I am still learning to quantify. Don't quantify it, he murmured, his voice gentle. Just feel it. She looked up, and in the depths of her silver eyes, he saw the shimmering violet of cognitive dissonance. But this time it was not a sign of confusion or distress. It was the color of wonder. They stood in the twilight on the roof of a broken world they had broken together, their hands linked, and the first stars beginning to pierce the deepening sky. The war was over, the weapons were silent, but the true work, the messy, illogical, and hopeful work of building a future, had only just begun.